Greetings and welcome. My name is Don Alexander. I'm President and Managing Director of GeneCoda Executive and Professional Search. We connect outstanding firms in the life sciences sector with executives who help bring game-changing products to the market. I'm pleased to be joined here today with Barry Buzogany, an advisory board member of our firm. Barry is a professional board director and former C-suite executive for both public and private pharmaceutical, life sciences, med tech, and contract research organizations. Barry is currently serving as director on select advisory and statutory boards to share his wealth of leadership experiences, extensive domain knowledge, and lessons learned as an accomplished operations and legal executive and entrepreneur. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Barry. In this video series, Barry and I will be discussing the functions of corporate and advisory boards, including the legal and practical differences and pros and cons of each, why consider a board of directors or advisory board, and when is the right time, how to form a board and criteria for selecting board members, and how to compensate board members of the board of directors or advisory board. In today's discussion, we'll learn about how to form a board and criterion for selecting board members. So Barry, we touched on this previously, but how does one really go about formally creating a board of directors or advisory board?
Well, we did touch on it previously that a statutory board is called that because it is a creature of state law. And so in forming a board, the company itself has to comply with state law. And so typically you file an articles of incorporation with the state, and this is done by the shareholders of the company at the time, whether they're just a founder and CEO or whether they are actual investors in the company at that point in time. So the shareholders actually would elect the board. They would then create bylaws, and that's really a very important document because that sets forth the rules of governance for board activity, board structure, and actually the roles and responsibilities of board members are set forth in the bylaws. And so that's an important document that, as I call it, sets forth the rules of governance in terms of minutes and meetings and so forth, like all set forth there. Now, so in addition to those two, there's, you're kind of in play at that point, but on the advisory board side, it's much less formal because we talked about the fact that an advisory board is less structured, and it doesn't have to worry about state law. It's not governed by state law in that sense in terms of its creation. It's a creature of the imagination of the CEO, if you will, or the board. I mean, it could be that a board of directors will ask the company to form an advisory board as well. And there you're just talking about having an agreement with each board, advisory board member, an advisory board agreement it's called, and in which you would put terms such as a confidentiality agreement and a non-compete agreement. You could fold those into an overall agreement with each director, each board advisor, I should say. And you also might consider a charter. A lot of your advisory board functions are centered around a charter, which is a good thing to have because it sets forth, again, sort of akin to the bylaws of a statutory board in terms of how it would be governed and operated. So that's a good document to think about because the CEO or the board in this case, it creates the need for them to give some thought to exactly how to put that advisory board together and what they want it to do.
Excellent. Great overview. So when you think then about the selection of the board itself for advisory board members, what are the key criterion that you think about or that one should think about when going through that selection process?
Yeah, that can vary widely, as we've said before, in terms of the criteria can depend on the type of company we're talking about. How is it a science company? Is it software, or just what kind of company is it? How's it organized? Is it public? Is it private? Is it nonprofit? All those things can affect the criteria one would apply in selecting board members. And typically, it's driven by the shareholders of the company initially. They're the ones who will interview and select additional board members and vote on those folks and establish that board, and then they'll elect a chairman from there. So in terms of what you look for, because we have spoken before about how it's a high-level responsibility, a strategic level responsibility at the board, you're looking for people with those kinds of, if you will, senior skills or experience. Ideally, they have prior board experience. That's extremely helpful because they've already got a sense for board governance and how it all should operate. So if not board level experience, you look for people that have C-level experience typically, again, because you're looking for talented professionals that have sort of been there and done that, so to speak, in terms of their years of experience in a related industry, or whether it's, you need access to capital markets, or you need R&D people, you need medical people. That, you look for both the experience at a senior level, so to speak, and then you look for the domain knowledge that they have as it might apply to that particular company. And I'm referring now to independent directors, by the way, non-officer directors, because it's a different ball of wax if you have an early stage company and the founder wants to bring in somebody he used to work with as a board member, or somebody like that, or name one of his officers to the board. I'm really referring to criteria to select an independent director. And again, that's going to be driven by the shareholders who are going to make up that board initially. Now, on the advisory board side, I mentioned a charter. Another way to look at that is to give some thought to what you as the CEO, or you as the chairman of the board who wants to form an advisory group, what you need. So you have to do sort of gap analysis. Okay, what does my team over there really need in terms of filling gaps in knowledge, expertise, domain expertise. So you could do a gap analysis initially, and you could put up pencil to paper and write a mission statement too, which is another good idea, because again, much like the same function as a charter, you're really giving some thought to, before you just go thinking about people and candidates, what do I really need, and how do I want them to govern themselves? So you might have a mission statement would be a good idea. It's typically more tactical, as we've said before. And so now you're looking at deep domain expertise kinds of folks, whether you need them in whatever endeavor it might be based on the type of company you're running. If you've got a life sciences company, as we said before, you might need some science folks. You might need to have an actual scientific advisory board. So again, there's always that it depends at the end of much of what I'm saying, but you're looking for relevant experience, credibility, and you want highly networked people too, because you want them to be door openers for you, as they call it, and connecting you to other people, other companies, entities that you might need now or in the future, you as the CEO of that company. So you bring in advisors who, again, they have a reputation, they're connected, and they have a diversity of skills.
Great. What about investors? What role would they prototypically play regarding board governance?
Well, if there are investors on the board at present, then they are typically going to have an acute awareness of the need for good corporate governance. Why? Because as investors, they have skin in the game, so to speak. They want to protect their investment and that of the other shareholders and the company. And so they are going to know what it means to have a fiduciary duty, for example, and to have some potential exposure, as we've talked about before, legal exposure, and that duty of care and loyalty we referred to. Investors are sophisticated in that way, and so they are going to typically insist that we have, let's form some committees on the board, for example. Let's have an audit committee. Let's have a compensation committee. In other words, let's do things by the book, because they may be public, they may be governed by the SEC or NASDAQ, and so they have to be in legal compliance and overall compliance with the rules of the game, so to speak, and governance is critically important. So I wouldn't, be too concerned if we really are talking about investors on the board, because again, initially the shareholders are going to form that board, and they should be sophisticated in the ways of and importance of board governance. Now on the advisory board side, perhaps less so, because again, less structure, less formality to an advisory board. It's discretionary on the part of the CEO. And so you don't have to worry about fiduciary duty. You don't have that legal duty or that exposure. So you can bring in investors for sure. Venture capitalists can come in and so forth. But you don't have the actual legal rules of governance that apply to a board of directors for an incorporated company. On the other hand, you want to be able, as you as the CEO or the board of that company who've brought in advisors, you want to be able to demonstrate to the outside world that you have a formality to your processes, that you have a sophistication to how you operate your business, because you're going to want to give that impression to outside investors and to others whose services you might need going forward. And so it's while there's you don't have the strict rules of that are affecting a board of directors, you do want to have, as I say, a formality to the process of, and that's why you want to have this board advisor agreement in place, and setting forth rules within there about how often they meet and what their duties are. So there is that level of sophistication that's still necessary.
Fantastic. And as companies are thinking about forming boards and or adjusting boards over time, I mean, are there prototypical size guidelines for, say, a board of directors or advisory board? And if you can elaborate on that.
Sure. As to boards of directors, what I've read is that you should have a workable size, and what that really means, in my view, is that it's important to keep a working board pretty small, and in other words, to keep them focused on the responsibilities they have, the accountabilities they have to the shareholders of the company. So you don't want a gang of directors, so to speak. And I would say 3 to 7 is typical. Probably a lot of companies will start out maybe with 5. And why do I mention 3, 5, and 7? Those are odd numbers, right? Well, that's important too, because it's always wise to have an odd number of directors, because again, they make decisions by vote and have to have a quorum to hold the vote. And you don't want to have 8 directors and have a very important matter come before the board and they vote for against and for it. So that could be a problem, because now you have a standoff. So I just mentioned that for what it's worth, that the size should be relatively small, and the total number of them should typically be an odd number. Now, on the advisory board side, that's Katie bar the door. That's a really wide range depending on the company. You can have 3, you can have 23, and that's because it might be, based on the gap analysis you've done in terms of how many to bring in. You might decide you only need 3 advisors. You might need 7 or 8 initially, but nonprofits are an example of where you could get up into the 20. Typically, you can have. I served on a board some years ago, a nonprofit board that was covered 2 states. It was part of a national organization. We covered 2 states. We had 13 directors and were authorized to go to 15. So that's why it can vary so widely. Now, it's also fair to say that you don't have to have an advisory board. A company can hire individual advisors. So I just wanted to make that clear too. If you only need maybe 2 people to come in and give you some help on the financial side, maybe, or whatever it might be, they don't have to form a board per se. You can come up with an individual agreement as well for each of those folks. But again, prototypical size, you'd like to keep those numbers down too, to the 5 or 6 range if you can, but it can vary quite a bit.
Great. Our next video in this series will be about compensation and compensating members of the board of directors and advisory board.